So there's a little bit more to this code here. What we want to do is we want to track some details about the specific card for use later. Among those things, we want to track the number of the fruit or the image. So we'll store the number in a field in a field on the group. So we'll say card.num is equal to num. And then we have some flags here. Is the card currently flipping? We'll set that to false. Is the card currently face up? So face up means that the image is visible. We'll say false, even though we are showing the image. I'll change that in a moment. Store a reference to the card background and the card image in a named field on the group. Remember that card is a display group. And then attach a flipping method, a function that does the job of flipping. And I'm going to show you this in just a minute. We have 3 different flipping functions that you can choose from. A very basic flipping function, a flipping function that really doesn't flip, it does a little zoom in and out thing, and then one that looks more like a flip. It tricks your brain into thinking the card is flipping. So the last thing we need to do on this before we look at the flipping code, which is the part I said I was going to say we were going to examine, is the touch. So at the very end here, we have supplied a touch function, which is attached to the background, not to the card. Why? Because the rectangle is the part that we can touch with our finger or with our pointer. I do believe you can attach a touch listener to a display group. I'm quite sure you can. I don't suggest it, however, unless you know exactly what you're doing. And the reason is the rules of how touches work are not straightforward for the beginner. A touch needs something to touch, in a sense. It needs some fill for that touch point to fall through to, in a sense, to be detected. I'm not saying this exactly right, but if you think of it logically, when you touch, you're touching something. So if I touch over here off the edge of the card, you would expect nothing to happen. But if I touch the image, you would expect something to happen. So the way Corona detects this is, when you haven't set any of the non-standard settings, it simply says, hey, I've got a touch at position 100, 200. Is there a pixel underneath that has been rendered? Okay, what shape does that pixel belong to? All right, does it have a touch listener? Yes, it does. Call the touch listener. Touch listener is called. If the touch listener returns true, processing stops at that point. No more processing is done for that touch against objects, because that object has essentially said, hey, I caught the touch, I'm done processing it, don't pass it on to anybody else. However, if the touch listener returns false, then the Corona system says, okay, I executed that touch listener. It says that it's okay for me to continue processing. Let me peel back the layers in a sense. Let's go to the next rendering layer. Is there another pixel? What object does that belong to? Does it have a touch listener? So on and so forth until you run out of objects that the touch, in a sense, could have hit. So that's the basic standard setting. But then you can do other tricky things. You can set a flag called is hit testable, and another one that is hit masked. And these have to do with alpha settings or transparency of the point where you're applying the touch. And so that becomes a lot more complicated for new users. So again, backing up, what did I say? You can attach a touch listener to the group, but then you have to start thinking, is there something visible there? Is there a visible element for that to touch? If not, maybe the touch won't be registered. I'll get some kind of strange behavior. So in this case, I said the most straightforward way to explain this is to attach the touch listener to the rectangle itself, and then within the touch listener, refer to the card, because I have the card defined above, This code is all of this code, the card reference right here. Card is flipping, card is face up, card is within scope. So this code can see that reference and do something with it. So when they touch the background, the image, the rounded rectangle, the first thing I do is I check to see, is the card flipping? In other words, is it in the middle of being flipped over? If it is, do nothing, because I don't want to have two touch processing events going on for that card at the same time. And I return true because I know that I don't have anything else that needs to catch that touch, so I just want to stop it right there. Then I check, is the card face up? I could have allowed people to touch the card again to flip it over, but since I may flip it over for them, basically, once the card has been flipped, I set the flag is face up to true. If that is true, do not allow the touch to do anything. Exit, return true, done. Finally, I want the flip to occur when the person touches and then lifts their finger. And the way to do this is to check for event phase equal ended. Now, if I wanted to be extremely careful, I could also say event phase equals ended or canceled. And the canceled event will occur in certain rare instances, but for the purpose of this example, I thought it was simple enough to express that we want to do this when the finger is lifted. The finger lifted event is called ended for touches. So if they have lifted their finger, event phase equals ended, then we immediately set the flag is flipping. We call the method the function that I attached here, and I'll explain why I call it a method versus a function in a minute. We call the method flip, and we post an event to the sound effects system to play the click sound, which we haven't discussed yet. So why do I call flip a method versus a function? It's a distinction that I like to make that is usually unimportant to most people. Right here what we've got is a good example of this. The touch function is a function, but it's also a method in that it's aware that it is attached to an object. So if I were to type code like this, what that would do is Corona would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe this is a Lua thing. It would, actually this is a Lua thing. It would say, okay, I've got an object called back. The user is trying to call the function touch. Oh, they use the colon notation. What that means is call touch, but pass in as the first argument a reference to back, which is why I have a variable in my definition called self. So self will contain a reference to the object, and then the rest of the arguments are whatever gets passed when you call it or is passed by the event system. In this case, event is automatically passed by the touch handling system. So again, while flip3 may be a function, I want to define it as a method. So when I call it later, I can call it with the colon notation, and it will automatically pass a reference to the card in. I could equally have done it this way, or just as easily said card dot flip card. These two lines of code are exactly equivalent. In terms of this one says find a function called flip, pass in card. This one with the dot says find a function called flip and pass in whatever is passed between the parentheses. Don't do anything automatically. It's just a ease of use thing, but it's also something you need to keep in mind when you're using this technique here, which is where I attached a event listener named touch, which is the same name as the event, a touch, to the object. What I've done here is implied that there's a function for Corona to find later on. So when I do this add event listener, and I just say look for the event touch, it's attached to this object, Corona will say, aha, he didn't pass in a reference, which implies that the function is attached here. It will go and look for it and find it, and everything will be good to go.